Okay, so welcome to tonight's PSR webinar. This is Radioactive Fracking Wastewater, a Chilling Threat to Health. I'm Barbara Gottlieb, the Director for Environment and Health at PSR, and I'm delighted to host our event tonight. Before we get started, just a few very quick housekeeping details. First of all, tonight's webinar will be recorded. The link to the recording will be made available to everybody who registered. We'll send that out to everyone who registered, and if anybody else wants it, all they have to do is contact PSR. We'll be delighted to share it. Our webinar tonight runs for 1 hour. We're going to be ending promptly at 9 o'clock so everybody can watch the presidential debate. Tonight, during the presentation and also during the question and answer period that will follow the presentation, all of our attendees will be on mute. So if you have a question and want to ask the question, then in the little dock or kind of drop-down box on the right-hand side, there's a gray bar that says questions. Type your question in there. You can type it in at any point during the presentation. And at the end, I will read the questions out so that our presenter doesn't have to be looking at that little tiny box. All of you will be on mute then throughout. And I think that's all in the way of housekeeping details. Let's get down to business. I'd like to give a brief introduction to our presenter tonight, Justin Nobel. I hope, first of all, that everybody on the webinar has had a chance to read his really spectacular article in Rolling Stone magazine that is the topic of tonight's presentation. You know, I was thinking an article like that doesn't just happen. The bio that I'll share with you, I think will give you a sense of why Justin Nobel is the person who was able to discover, pursue, and reveal tonight's story. So Justin Nobel writes on issues of science and the environment for Rolling Stone, Audubon, Oxford America, D-Smog, and other U.S. magazines, investigative sites, and literary journals. His work has been published in Best American Travel Writing 2011 and 2016, and Best American Science and Nature Writing 2014. A book that he co-wrote with a death row ex-honoree, The Story of Dan Bright, was published in 2016 by the University of New Orleans Press. He's presently working on a book about the issue of the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas production and the many different pathways of contamination that it poses to the industry's workers, the public, local communities, and the environment. This book will be published with Simon & Schuster and is tentatively titled Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It. His work on this issue is supported by the journalism nonprofit Economic Hardship Reporting Project. Justin, I'm delighted to welcome you as our presenter tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, PSR, for putting this together. Really appropriate that I'm speaking with PSR here. Physicians for Social Responsibility was the group that initially reached out to me more than 2 years ago with their compendium on the harms of fracking, and that is what really started me down the path, at least that led me towards this topic and just the incredibly complex rabbit hole that I ended up falling in. So yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you everyone here for joining. I just want to repose the research question that I began with, because I think it puts everyone in the right frame of mind. So the question was, let's examine the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas production and the many different pathways of contamination posed to the industry's workers, the public and communities, and the environment. And to start looking into this question, there was a lot of research, and there was research papers, there's the scientific journals, there's actually a fairly large body of work on this issue. So I would read papers, I would follow the interesting citations in those papers and then read those papers and go on down that pathway, and then connect with the authors of these papers and have conversations with them. And usually someone like that would have a couple new papers to recommend or a couple new people, and just really branch out. And the branches on this tree really started growing and becoming more complex. I want to again go back to you all, to folks listening, because this was an integral part of making this story happen. So while I'm doing the research, I would also be going back to communities, often in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, but North Dakota, Colorado, Texas, other oil and gas states as well, and connecting with people on the ground, connecting with workers, connecting with community members. And this, I think, is so important to highlight, because I have heard from colleagues, journalistic colleagues, this kind of fear of talking to the activists because they have a skewed idea about things. And I just think it's so wrong. And I tell people time and again, these are not, don't call folks activists. These are people in communities who have the courage to care, who have the courage to speak up on very complicated issues against many odds within their communities often, and the courage to talk about something and document it, really document it with phones, with writing, and in a way with their own bodies and with their own stories. And this is really, I think, the front lines of investigative journalism. And I think as a journalist you don't recognize that, you are going to miss the entire story. And so it's just so important. And I know the difficulty that it takes to do that work, and I'm just so appreciative. And it's that ecosystem, the science journals, the researchers behind the science, and then people on the ground observing and recording, and me being able to talk to them, and the workers, that really made this story possible. Yeah, I'll start here with a slide that is, I think, a quote really that brings this issue to light in such a powerful way. In one sense, this is such a complicated topic, but it's because I think most folks haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I had not spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I had to look at it for quite a while before it started to make sense. But this quote right here really brings it just so clearly into picture. So this is a quote from Dr. Marco Keltefen, who became one of many really prominent sources in the story, a nuclear forensic scientist. He's been looking at oil and gas radioactivity and radioactivity in general around the world for many years. And so here's the quote. Y'all can see it, but I'll read it anyway. Essentially, what you are doing is taking an underground radioactive reservoir and bringing it up to the biosphere, where it can interact with people and the environment. That is oil and gas development. It's not the definition of oil and gas development that we typically picture when we imagine oil and gas development, but that's it. This is happening as well. We are bringing this radioactive reservoir up to the surface, to the world and where we all live. And I think when you visualize that and process that, you then leave room to really have some of the legitimate concerns that develop down the line. And this is just this is my drawing. There are versions of this drawing, but some of this material just hasn't actually been written about, at least prominently in textbooks. So here I did my own drawing, and the main point of this is just to show the difference between a fracked well, what is often referred to as unconventional oil and gas development, that's on the right, and then a conventional well, which would be on the left. And this was really one of the first major revelations in this reporting. Initially, I had thought that for some reason fracking was radioactive, and it was just fracking, and maybe just the Marcellus, and that was the issue. And when I knew that the story was much bigger was when I realized that no, this involved all oil and gas development, not just in the US, but everywhere. The radioactivity brought to the surface is something happening across wells, and different formations have different levels, but this was an issue that the entire industry deals with and has been dealing with since literally the first well was drilled. And so just very quick through the science of this, your mother lode for oil and gas is going to be a layer called a black shale. This is where oil so sorry, stepping back a moment. Black shale, think of a shallow marine environment such as maybe the Mediterranean right now or the Gulf of Mexico. You have a shallow sea, you have organic material accumulating at the bottom of that shallow sea. You have algae and other small marine organisms living, dying, falling to the bottom, and accumulating down there. And so this is organic rich material, and it's this dead marine algae this that will create, literally in the future, that will become your oil and gas. It will be compacted into this layer, pressed, other geologic layers will form on top of it, and your oil and gas will literally come from that dead marine algae, and that layer is called a black shale. But also, in that same shallow marine environment, you're not just accumulating organic material, you're accumulating uranium-238 and thorium-232. These are two long-lived radioactive elements, and since this is a science crowd, I can take a quick little aside here. I mean, what's stunning about this is that these elements, they're referred to as primordial radionuclides, which means they've literally been on Earth since essentially the beginning of time. And you think back to the early days of Earth, there were many more radioactive elements than there are now, but they went through the process of radioactive decay and eventually became stable elements. Well, these two ones, uranium-238 and thorium-232, their half-lives are so long that they have not had time to decay to stable elements. So we still have them. They're like our little radioactive friends from the beginning of time. And they're and what's extraordinary is that we have known for a long time that they're there. So this is a USGS paper from 1960, oil yield and uranium content of black shales. And here is another major revelation. It's not news that black shales are radioactive. In fact, we've known this paper in 1960 clearly, and the relationship is inherent. Black shales will have a radioactivity signature, and that radioactive signature is often in line with the organic content. And what I think is so amazing about this paper, look who it was done for. It was actually done for the Atomic Energy Commission. So we were looking at black shales in the 1960s, not for their oil content, but for their uranium content. And these are some quotes pulled from that paper, just to illustrate this point. A fairly positive relation between oil yield and uranium content exists for some of these shales. And the next quote just blew me away. Oil obtainable from the shales is considered as a possibly important byproduct when the uranium is extracted. That is pretty phenomenal. And then the amount of uranium in these shales is extremely large, reckoned in billions of tons of metallic uranium. And this comes into play in a huge way with layers that are being fracked, such as the Marcellus, in which we are intentionally drilling into the black shales. So if we go back to our little diagram, we're not always drilling into a black shale. And conventional oil is oil or gas that has escaped the black shale. Over time, oil and gas has seeped out of the black shale, and it's collected in what's called the trap. And when you drill into that type of oil and gas deposit, it's like a pocket sitting in the ground. It's often at pressure, and you think, West Texas, Beverly Hillbilly style, the oil will literally fountain out of the ground often. That's a conventional oil layer. And fracking is different because you drill into a black shale, the oil or gas is still stuck in there tight, and it does not fountain out of the ground. We have to frack it. We have to crack open the layer for the oil and gas to come out. So an important point there, oil and gas will always have a radioactive, or it has the potential to always have a radioactive signature, but for reasons we'll get into in a moment with fracking, we're bringing up this new type of material. We're bringing up the drill cuttings from the black shale layer itself. So before we get there, I'll just explain one last critical element, which is, what are the materials that are radioactive? And this, again, we have to just retune our image of what oil and gas production entails. Of course, we bring oil and gas up to the surface, and it is brought through pipelines to refineries or different facilities, and the products that pretty much all of us use every day are made. But it's actually a lot more sloppy than that. Oil and gas brings an incredible amount of waste to the surface, and one of the primary forms of waste is this toxic liquid called brine. And so these little tanks on this diagram, you're going to have oil or gas accumulating at a wellhead and being collected. You're also inevitably going to have brine, and the amount of brine is extraordinary. Often there will be 7 to 10 times as much brine brought up at an oil well as there is oil. So this is a significant waste product. It has extraordinarily high levels of salt. It has volatile organics such as benzene. These are a known human carcinogen. It has toxic heavy metals, and it's also going to have the radioactive element radium. And we just think back to that initial idea of the uranium and thorium. The reason you accumulating there in these layers, the reason that radium is often the element of concern in brine is because radium has this tendency to flow with water, and the saltier a brine is, there's often a geochemical relationship. The saltier brine is, the more likely it is to kick radium out of the rock formation and bring it up to the surface with the brine. So this is really where part of the radioactive investigation starts. We look at the brine and we look at the radium levels in the brine, and we have to start thinking about how is brine handled. If you don't live in an oil and gas field or an area of oil and gas production, but this brine remains invisible. If you do, you're well aware of it, because often what is happening right now is it's put into trucks, and those trucks are driven by a human being, by a driver, to often either an injection well where it's put back into the deep earth, injected under pressure back into the deep earth, or some sort of treatment center. And all of these pathways are worrisome. And just to go back a little bit of history, so right, if brine has always come up, what did we used to do with brine? Well, in Louisiana, for example, brine was just literally put out into the bayou, or literally put out into the farmer's field that was right next to the oil well. Radium, this radioactive element in brine, in Louisiana, they found that radium was accumulating in oysters. So it was recognized, and that was realized in the early 1990s, that radium could be accumulating in oysters. So there were these moments of revelation for the industry, and brine over time, of course, now I don't think it's regularly put into a bayou, and the method of disposing of brine changed, and now the common method is the injection well, although these treatment centers are becoming more common. But so this is still a major problem, and this takes us to the next slide. How is it that you can have a truck driver pull up to an oil and gas well and fill their truck with a liquid that is so toxic? Even before we get to the radioactivity, brine is toxic heavy metals, arsenic, benzene as well. And then we add in radium. How is this possible? Well, this is possible because of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and Benson and Bevel Amendment. Benson and Bevel, by the way, Texas senator and an Alabama congressman, both Democrats, who initiated this exemption. And this exemption is devastating. So what it says, sorry, take one step back. Let's think of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is actually a great idea. In the late 70s, the country was coming to the realization that industry produced a lot of hazardous waste. But let's at least appropriately recognize the hazardous waste as hazardous. Let's put it into trucks designed to carry hazardous waste. Let's have the drivers be appropriately trained to haul hazardous waste, and let's put it in a landfill, finally, that's appropriately designed to hold hazardous waste. So yes, we'll have hazardous waste, but we'll appropriately designate it, and it will be, the term is cradle to grave, appropriate handling of this waste. Well, guess which waste stream, which industry received a stunning exemption? The gas industry received this exemption. So all oil and gas waste that comes to the surface at an oil and gas wellhead. This is the brine, this is drill cuttings, which we can talk about in a bit. This is sludges and scales which form on the inside of oil field pipes and can often be even more radioactive than brine. If you think about your kitchen sink, you know, there's fluid moving through it, moving through the pipes in your kitchen sink constantly, but often gunk will accumulate over time. And same thing in an oil field pipe, and that gunk can have radium, this radioactivity that's even higher than is in the brine. So all of these wastes, the scale, the sludge, the drill cuttings, the brine, they all receive this exemption. And in 1988, the EPA actually assessed this exemption, and they recognized that there are known hazards in oil and gas waste. There's uranium, there's radioactivity, there's heavy metals, there's a lot of worrisome elements, yet we are gonna still give a classification as non-hazardous. And so I just, again, right there, but I'll read it because this is so stunning and everything stems from this. So essentially, 1988, the EPA determined that if they were to label oil and gas waste as hazardous, which science, any reasonable scientific analysis tells you it is hazardous, but if we were to call it hazardous, it would cause a significant increase. It would cause a permitting burden. It would cause a severe economic impact on the industry. So right there, a severe economic impact. This industry potentially may not even be able to exist if we were to recognize that their hazardous waste was hazardous. And then permitting burden is significant as well. They're basically saying we literally would not have enough landfills, we would not have enough regulators. Well, now we can understand our present dilemma. The EPA even, foreshadowed it early on in the 80s, but unfortunately, that exemption has stuck. Through every single administration since then. We've had Democrats in power, we've had Republicans. Nobody on the presidential level, at least, has, to my knowledge, tried to address that exemption. And yet, the exemption is the reason why a brine hauler, a truck driver, a human being, can be driving a truck with often with no labeling except a little word at the corner of the truck that says brine, and yet that truck is holding hazardous waste that often also has a very high radioactivity level. That truck will drive through a community, next to a school, next to a reservoir. We've had cases in Ohio where a brine truck has spilled right next to a reservoir. Brine has gone across a farmer's field into a creek that goes into the reservoir. None of this could happen if these trucks were appropriately labeled as hazardous. If that exemption didn't exist, they would be. And then we'll move there in a second, but these workers would not be put in these very harrowing situations if that exemption did not exist. They would have to be trained to handle hazardous waste. And this really is what becomes just so devastating with this issue, is that brine haulers, workers who are driving the trucks carrying brine, and this is a significant job across Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia area alone. There's thousands of brine trucks on the road. This is a common industry job. These drivers are often told that they're hauling water. They're not hauling water. They're hauling an extraordinarily toxic substance, and we'll get into the exposures in a moment, but you want to talk about, deregulate, it's good for business. Well, this is the human harm of that deregulation. Someone is handling a material that should receive extraordinary care, and yet they're not given that care, they're not given that protection because they've been told they're hauling water. And these are just some fascinating quotes. Many of them I think were in the story. What happens if you close that exemption? Different opinions, but essentially the cost calculus for this entire industry crumbles instantly. Okay, major point of shock for in my reporting was to realize that the oil and gas industry has known about this issue, not just have they known about it? They have written about it. So there is a set of really powerful papers from the 1980s and 90s where they openly discuss it. So here's one from the Oil and Gas Journal. Radioactive materials could pose problems for the gas industry. And you can't get more straightforward than that. And we look at some of the quotes from the paper. And I'll just read the first one. In varying degrees of severity, norm. Norm, by the way, is what the industry and regulators often call the radioactivity brought to the surface with oil and gas. So it stands for naturally occurring radioactive materials. And as I always say, as a journalist, words are so important. And wow, I've got to give it to the industry for coming up with the word norm to describe this extraordinarily dangerous material. So we call it norm. In varying degrees of severity, norm contamination may exist at every oil and gas production site and related facilities, including pipe handling yards, metal reclamation areas, natural gas and NGL pipelines, gasoline plants, refineries, and terminals. Basically, everywhere, the entire stretch of the oil and gas apparatus. And I'm gonna just skip this for a moment, get back to that slide. Another revelation that the industry, not only have they been writing about it since the 1980s and 1990s, but our geologists here on Earth, in our world, have known about this since 1904. So this is the first recognized paper that looks at the radioactivity in oil and gas, and it's called the Radioactive Gas from Crude Petroleum. They looked at an oil field in southern Ontario, and what the researcher did, they went to a farmer who had an oil well on their property, and they were able to measure, they were able to look at a radioactive gas that was coming out of crude oil, and they were able to determine the gas was radioactive because it was leaving an imprint on these forms of photographic plates. So a radioactive substance, it's giving off radiation, which if you use these types of photographic plates can leave an imprint. And so at that point, we didn't even realize that they called radon, because radon had not been formally named yet, so they call it a radioactive gas. But they had found radon. Why this is important is because this is a wonderful, simple, elegant scientific study that a high school student could do today. And if they did this in the Marcellus or in Colorado or in the Bakken, we would learn an extraordinary amount about risk. We would learn how much radon was in gas coming up at the wellhead. And again, this study could be produced, it'd be great, a science class could do it, but the industry has not granted access. And thus a study that was done 116 years ago remains, something that is novel, and we haven't followed up on that. Okay, so yeah, turning to another really devastating point in the reporting, the big question I had as I talked to oil and gas workers, as I talked to brine haulers, was are the symptoms that many of them are experiencing, are the risks that they're facing, are they really something of significant harm? Can they lead to physical harms? Can they cause cancer? And I think it's important to note, a brine hauler does not just drive a brine truck. They often will have to crawl inside a brine tank to clean it out. They have virtually no protection when they're doing that. And they can be in there for up to an hour. This job could be done, once a week by the same worker. They're given literally like a squeegee and a shovel and told to scrape the waste out. So again, thinking back to the brine, the sludge will have an even greater radioactive signature. So they're crawling around in sludge with no respirator, not thinking that they're in radioactive waste, and cleaning this material out. It's getting over their clothes, and then they're bringing that home to their family. So the question is, well, is this really something to be worried about? And the devastating realization is yes, because we have a set of Louisiana legal cases only recently settled that convey indisputably that various oil and gas worker cancers were linked to their radioactivity exposure received on the job. And this is just the cover of that. This is the report written by the radiation expert in these legal cases that conveys in detail, granular detail, the information, the introduction, I think says quite a lot. During these times, the workers were regularly exposed without their knowledge to naturally occurring radioactive materials in the course of oil field pipe cleaning, as well as other jobs. Some of the really run-of-the-mill oil and gas industry jobs, roustabout, roughneck, truck driver driving sludge or pipes filled with scale. And what happened is, and so I'm now going to the page where it lists these percentages on the right. It lists the primary cancer type, and if you look at the bottom, it has abbreviation for these cancers. So suddenly a picture emerges what an oil and gas worker can receive. The percentages are connected to this program, IREP, which was developed by our own government, by the CDC, to analyze exposures amongst nuclear industry workers. And essentially, the program tabulates up exposure in detail. And so even someone, you look at the job, look at how long they work the job, and often, I think it's important to know many of these workers work their jobs for 10, 15, 20 years. But even look at something like, did they eat lunch in a workplace environment? And as is mentioned in the report, even licking your lips, something like that, you're going to lick dust off your lips invariably. If you're working in a dusty environment where scale is being cleaned off a pipe, that's going to be radioactive. That will add to your exposure. And so these numbers are the chance that this worker's cancer was indeed linked to the radioactivity exposure received on the job. And as you can see, the percentages are devastating. I mean, so we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and as both the attorney and the radiation expert conveyed to me, these numbers are indisputable. So the industry has settled these cases. This is an industry that does not like to settle, but on this issue, they have settled. They can't go up against that science, and I think that is just so important here. Coming from a perspective of people fighting this industry, suddenly, this, in my mind at least, surpasses climate change as an issue that can actually get to the pocketbooks. But I think the most important thing is to the workers. And yeah, this is a slide that explains levels. I think if you've read the paper, the levels become pretty clear, but we'll just quickly talk about that. We're looking at radium, 2 different isotopes of radium, EPA safe drinking water limit for radium 226 and 228. These are the 2 isotopes of radium most common in oil and gas waste and very common in brine. It's 5. The radium is a very worrisome element. We do not want a lot of it in the water we drink. We want it below 5. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a limit as well. Add the isotopes together, that limit would be 120. EPA defines anything above 60 as radioactive. So we have 5, we have 120, we have 60. And then here on this page is a list of what some of the common oil and gas plays in the US, what they've registered as far as the radium content, and looking at both isotopes together, the radium content in the brine. So we, with our limits, we have 5, 120, 60, and here we go, Gulf Coast, 3,087. Bakken Formation, 6,760. Important to note, the Ohio Clinton Formation, that is a conventional formation, also pretty extraordinarily high levels. And down at the bottom, Marcellus Formation, where we're cracking into this known black shale layer, it's really high, 28,500. I'm going to look at this slide, though, in terms of the Louisiana legal cases. So we know that, look at the Gulf Coast, brine with and these, by the way, these are the high limits. And the reason I can't give an average is because there's not enough data points to know what the average is. It's actually easier just to say, this is the highest level recorded. Took a good bit of research to get this list. I list the sources of all of this here. No one else has compiled this. The USGS does not have a list like this, but clearly they should, because what an important question. We know that in Louisiana, so it would be the Gulf Coast, the levels around 3,087 picocuries per liter, that's radium in the brine, and it would be that brine that would indicate or determine the radioactive levels in the spludges and the scales and other things connected to the brine. So that level was enough to cause cancer in workers who work these jobs for a period of time. But has anyone examined the Bakken and seen if workers have cancer there? Not that I'm aware of. Has anyone looked at conventional Ohio and Pennsylvania layers, see if workers who have worked in those industries have cancer? Not that I'm aware of. Has anyone looked at the Permian, this booming oil and gas play that is, you know, any boom, you get workers from all over the country coming in. Also, the Permian is a conventional play that's been going for decades. Has anyone looked to see if the cancers mentioned in the Louisiana cases are here? Not that I'm aware of, but yet, again, Gulf Coast, the levels are around 3,000. Permian, we're at 10,000. And then the Marcellus, we're at 28,500. So reasonable science would tell you that if you had cancers in the Gulf Coast with oil and gas workers working in the different settings of the industry and at those levels, you're going to have cancers in these other plays. It just has not been examined in a formal way yet. And this is just such a devastating photo. This was only recently passed to me. So this job of crawling into the brine truck that I was just describing, often called the swamper, at least in some areas, and you know, this is from social media, so you know, grabbed it just like anyone can grab a photo from Facebook. This actually was passed to me by a colleague of this worker, but like, they would not be smiling if they knew what they were covered in. And again, this person will bring their clothes home and often and wash it in the family washing machine. And this quote at the bottom, you know, how I asked, how do people not complain if they're inside? The truck is going to have horrible smells, you know, regardless of the radioactivity. So many volatile organics in there, you know, and they talk about guys trying to be tough and, you know, I could beat your record of how long I could stay in this radioactive truck. And although they don't know it's radioactive, and if they complain, their boss tells them to go home. Here's another video. Here's an industry video. They're proud to show this video of this worker cleaning out a frac tank, which again could have extraordinarily high levels because there's sludge, as you see in the middle picture, that they're cleaning out. And the industry is advocating that they're intentionally, you know, here's our great model, no respirator, no dosimeter, I mean, no knowledge of radioactivity. So, you know, I leave it there, and I really leave it with a note of alarm, which I think is appropriate because this is what we're dealing with. This came out recently, and I think it's really important to note a rebuttal from the Health Physics Society, who claim to have a mission, excellence in the science and practice of radiation safety, and they're, you know, debunking this article, which is great. All comments, all critiques, I think, are appropriate. A discussion generated is good, but their first line is actually inaccurate. They're telling us that or the second line, orders of magnitude below where any observable effects will occur. That's not true. We have these Louisiana legal cases which show that enough exposure can lead to cancer. And so I think there's so many things I'm eager to make people aware of, but the primary one is that oil and gas workers are continually and still right now to this day being put at risk, and neither the industry, the regulators, and even many outside groups have really come to their defense or told them what they're really dealing with. And I think there's downstream risks as well, but I'm going to leave that for the question period. And I'll just I'll leave it on this downstream slide though, because that could be interesting for people to read over while we go to questions. So yeah, with that, I'll turn to any questions. Thank you so much.
Well, Justin, thank you. That was surely chilling and a little bit mind-blowing. Certainly, for me, I'm not one of the longer-term researchers on fracking, but I've been looking at this issue for several years. And honestly, other than understanding that radon, the gas radon, could accompany gas oil coming out of the earth, I had no knowledge and certainly no appreciation of the extent of these really terrifying threats. Physicians for Social Responsibility, by the way, was actually formed not to deal with issues of environmental toxics or climate change, but to address the danger of the dangers from radiation to health associated with, first of all, with nuclear bombs, and then also to some extent with nuclear power. to realize that it's also a very central issue to our fossil fuel industry is a real eye-opener, and what we do about that is something I hope we'll get to in a question and answer period. Let me start off with, see, I have 2 questions for you here. One is, what is the lowest known radium level in the Marcellus brine? It's probably easy for industry to dismiss the highest as an anomaly.
Yeah, so a quick answer to that is I'll mention that those numbers actually came from a Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection report. 28,500 was the high level. The average of the unconventional, so the average in the Marcellus brines in that report was 9,000. So that the average is still high. I don't know off the top of my head what the lowest was, but typically Marcellus brine is in the 3,000 to 8,000 range, and in that report, the average is 9,000. And I think it's hard for the industry to discount this because, again, we have USGS reports going back to the 1960s determining that the radioactivity is very high in the Marcellus, and in fact, the industry itself uses the radioactivity to find the sweet spots for oil and gas development. Again, going back to that relationship between organic material and radioactivity, so the industry is well aware of this. I think it's quite hard for them to deny because they look for the radioactivity, which is something they can find relatively easily to determine where the best places to drill are.
Here's another question for you. I think you touched on this with the quote you showed us on a slide a moment ago. What has been the reaction from the oil and gas industry to your article?
Yeah, another great question. The Marcellus Shale Coalition, as they often do, has come out with a response. Often, you know, they take this route. If I publish with Rolling Stone, which I do because Rolling Stone has been great in allowing me to pursue these environmental stories, you know, they say Rolling Stone should stick to music. And my response back to them is it's actually pretty tragic. It's pretty sad that a music magazine had to publish material that their own industry has been sitting on for decades and actually affects their workers. So we've seen that level of response. I mentioned the Health Physics Society because that kind of brings the fight to a new level. This is, you know, ostensibly, at least, they're not connected to industry. This is a more open society of physicists, and I know there's some really great scientists in that group. So, you know, we now have another group coming back. I think the industry itself, though, you know, what has Shell said, what has ExxonMobil, they've given no reply. They do not want this issue to come to light. They would love for no one to ever talk about this again, because I think if a serious discussion occurs, you know, they have to make a lot of decisions that are very difficult for them.
Thank you. There are 2 questions that I think have to do with what you were referring to as downstreamers. Maybe I'll give you the questions one by one, and there are aspects to the potential downstream risks that you might want to touch on. So one of them asks, can you speak to the radioactivity levels in the water that is used to cool the stacks in gas-fired electric plants?
That's a great question. I don't know that. I don't know that. I haven't read about that issue, so I just do not have knowledge on that. But what I can say is that the radioactive risks at natural gas processing plants, in pipelines, in compressor stations, this is something very real, and the risks can be quite significant. So the reason, again, we think of radium coming up with the brine. Radium will decay to radon. At least radium-226 will decay to radon-222. And when I say decay, that just means the radioactive element, radium in this case, will just give off a burst of particles. Radium will give off an alpha particle, and this is radiation. It blasts off radiation. It literally loses a piece of itself, and then it's a new element, right? And in this case, in the case of radium-226, it's now become radon. Well, radon is a gas, and radon is a noble gas, which means it has this wonderful, kind of perfect physical structure. It does not necessarily like to bond to anything. So radon will flow with natural gas, and this is well known. And I think the page well, this page gets at it, but radon will flow with natural gas. And this is amazing. There's a 1973 EPA report that looks at radon in natural gas streams. So wow, it's there, it's flowing through the pipeline, but radon has a very quick half-life, about 3.8 days. So radon, as it flows with the gas stream, it will decay out. It will go through a radioactive decay, again, blast off more radiation, and it will become another element. And radon actually goes through a series of very quick decays until it becomes lead-210, which is a radioactive isotope of lead. And lead-210 will stick to the sides of the pipeline. So a big question now is, holy cow, how are we not sending radon up in our stoves when we, turn them on and let natural gas out in our homes? Well, another good scientific question. We don't know actually yet if we are or aren't necessarily, not enough research done there, but part of the reason is because the radioactivity will literally be in the pipelines and valves and pumps in the compressor station and the natural gas processing plant before you get to your home stove. To finish off that question, natural gas power plants have actually, I have not seen them looked at. The science tells me that there is going to be a massive amount of long-lived radon daughters like lead-210, and then after lead-210, there's further decay, and you get polonium-210, which if you read the bottom here statement, it's extraordinarily dangerous radioactive element. These are the things that are going to be accumulating in pumps, valves, and filters at these facilities. Natural gas-fired power plants just have not been looked at in detail in these industry reports from the 1980s and 1990s. So I can assume that it's going to be there in the pumps and valves, but we can say with certainty that pipelines will be accumulating these long-lived daughters, lead-210 and polonium-210, and even ethane cracker plants. Any radon will flow, has an even greater tendency to flow with the ethane stream. So an ethane pipeline will absolutely have radon. The levels will be very high, and the radon will be accumulating as it flows into lead-210, polonium-210, which means you have radioactive lead and polonium inevitably. I mean, inherently, there's no way to argue around this accumulating on the inside part of a pipeline carrying ethane, and then inside the pumps and valves of an ethane cracker plant. And just to really highlight this point, one of the workers I'm in touch with, not in the Rolling Stone story, but certainly will be in the book, is someone who cleans pumps and valves that come from compressor stations and ethane cracker plants. These pumps and valves, again, you think of your kitchen sink. It's if you have a filter, if you have a bend in something, that's where you're going to accumulate gunk. These pumps and valves, and this bottom statement that's up on the screen now speaks to it, would become coated with very high levels of lead-210 and polonium-210. They are sent through the U.S. mail, sometimes in dripping boxes, to, in this case, a worker who's working far from the oil field in Colorado. Their work site is literally across the street from a brewery, and they were never told that what they were cleaning was radioactive. They're a machinist. They work in this little office, no hood, no respirator, no ventilation, and it's a very intricate job of cleaning this gunk out of these complicated valves and pressure, and there's a demand to do it quickly because they got to send it back to the cracker plant or to the compressor station. So they're under stress doing this job. All the while they're creating dust. They're being smothered in radioactive dust, and this is actually some of the worst possible exposure, and it's directly connected to the ethane, to the petrochemical build out. So I know that's a long answer, but I just think it's so important to mention, it's not just, it accumulates on the valves and filters. A human being will have to clean those valves and filters. Chances are that human being will not be informed, just like most oil and gas workers aren't informed of the radioactivity, not be protected, and facing, in this case, really tremendous risks.
We have a number of questions related again to these more extensive threats. One is, while it's terrible that workers are threatened by radioactivity, what is the threat to the communities they drive through?
Right. Great question. And again, I think I need to preface it with not enough analysis has done to give a truly scientific response to that. But we can, there's a great group of researchers at Penn State who have looked at this. There's a really watershed paper called co-written by Bill Burgos. Nat Warner is another researcher at Penn State, and they looked at some of these hazards. So the biggest hazard is with a brine truck, if a brine truck spills. which the brine trucks can crash. They regularly crash, and so that's a risk. And that's why hazardous, trucks that are appropriately placarded with the hazmat symbol can't drive by a school. They can't go by a reservoir. That's because, if these trucks crash, we don't want them near these things. But that's not the case. So I think if you're a community member living next to, living on the on the road where some of these trucks, or if it's a dump truck carrying drill cuttings, these sorts of things are not necessarily worrisome on the day-to-day. Sure, some molecules of radium might be flying out the back of the truck inevitably, but that's not necessarily going to give you the type of exposure that's worrisome. But if a truck crashes, you're at risk. And another issue would be, okay, say an injection well. Regularly, brine is being injected into the injection well. Even though the industry and regulators will tell you otherwise, we do not have a good, solid understanding of what is happening below the surface at an injection well. Could this radium-rich brine be leaking into aquifers or drinking wells where people draw drinking water? It's a great question, and I have certainly not seen an appropriate scientific analysis to give an answer one way or the other. So, I think there certainly are risks, but if they're in kind of pointed places of this development, and not necessarily, just like walking by a truck once will lead to a concerning exposure.
There's one more question related to that. I actually suspect you don't have the answer, but I'm going to read the question, but just because I think it points to another potential area of exposure that we should all be thinking about. This says, in Massachusetts, the Sierra Club and others have worked with local Massachusetts boards of health about the human health risks of so-called natural gas. We called out the contaminants in the, this is quote, quote, natural gas, including radioactive isotopes, in the gas flowing in pipes, leaked into air, and piped into homes. Do we know the amount of radioactivity released into homes from gas cooking stoves?
Fantastic and absolutely critical question. We don't know that answer, but again, think back to that 1904 study. This answer could be gotten if there was political will. I know even researchers who have tried to get funding on this issue have not been able to. I mean, for one, a lot of state funding has been cut and is dwindling, for these sciences. But it's also difficult to get funding for an issue where the funders don't even know about the issue. So in terms of like steps taken, I think this is why it's so important to talk about this, and big groups that give out big pots of money need to know about it, so then they can appropriately give money to the scientists who can look at that exact question. In 1973, the EPA looked at that, the risk of radon coming in through your home stove, and they determined that it's a negligible risk. But that was before the fracking boom. So that was before we had layers like the Marcellus where the levels are much higher. So this is, I foresee a huge battle over the science here, but it wouldn't be too hard to get the right science. And one way to do it would just be, and I know New York State is pushing for a bill that would do just this. So what you would want to do is you would test the gas stream at what's called the gate, which is where a municipal or city system will take gas from a bigger transmission pipeline and then run it into their city system. So there's a gate there, and you can test right there. And based on those levels, you would at least have a good idea of how much then might still be getting into the homes. You could test in homes as well, although it'd be harder to do that. Although I think both should be done. We should be testing in homes and setting up studies like that, and we should be testing at the gate for radon. So yeah, great to push that. Great to take those questions to regulators. Those are the exact type of questions that need to be taken, and hopefully, actually research will eventually emerge on these issues and we'll have better answers.
Thank you for that. The next question, radon gas is a significant problem for some homes. Radon levels are much higher in some areas of the country compared to others. Is the same kind of thing true for the level of radiation in fracking wastewater, with some areas of the country having a much higher radiation level in wastewater compared to other areas of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to go back to this list I made, highest recorded reading for combined radium in various U.S. oil and gas plays. So this gives us a good idea. And right, it is the highest, but it was easiest to do the highest, but it does give us a good idea of where levels are the most worrisome. So if you look, actually, I've done a lot of work out in Colorado, and this doesn't mean radioactivity is not a concern in Colorado, but the radium levels are much lower in the Denver-Julesburg basin than they are in, for example, the Bakken or the Marcellus. And even within a layer, like the Permian Basin is a very complex layer. So 10,640, that was a high level from one part of the Permian, and levels may vary throughout the Permian. But yeah, there is a significant difference across areas. And I think, though, important to note, fracking waste, you're still going to have toxic heavy metals, you're still going to have volatile organics, you're still potentially going to have fracking chemicals. It's not good, but the radioactivity, it's not good from A to Z, but the radioactivity levels certainly will change from play to play.
We have a ton more questions, and I feel like it's a real disservice to a very serious-minded audience not to be able to share them all with you, and maybe Justin will be able to share them with you just for your own thinking opportunity. But we have only about 5 more minutes left, and there are 2 questions that kind of relate to one another. Let me find this one. Yeah, it says, it quotes you as saying the exemption from RCRA has stuck through every administration. That reflects the power of the oil and gas industry. How do we leverage the information you have shared to challenge their power? And there's another related question, which is, how do we get this message to the folks in the field?
Yeah, so really good to bring it here. So people in Ohio right now, I didn't even get into this really, but in many U.S. oil and gas producing states, it's become common practice to use brine on roads that we all use as either a dust suppressant or as a method of trying to keep down snow and ice removal. This is just, really a Stone Age mentality. This practice should have been stopped long ago, but this is happening. And this is one place where communities have actually just recently even been successful. So what they've done is they're going to their county officials who are in charge of this decision to allow or not allow oil field brine to be used on roads. And they're saying, this is crazy. Here's the science. You need to stop this. And in some cases, it's actually been stopped. And I think that it shows a kind of way into this. Start local, and especially if you're in an area where you have an issue, if it's not brine spreading, maybe it's a compressor station, which will have so many other issues, but also now this issue should be recognized, and just try at the lowest level, but also go up. And I know in many states, new people have come to office who have very different views than the people in office who created these terrible laws. So there's a great representative in Pennsylvania, Sarah Innamorato, represents the Pittsburgh area, and has really in a wonderful way come out. She just had a fantastic op-ed in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette talking against the petrochemical industry, why this handout to them is absurd, and about a better way forward. So I would say, start with anyone who you even have half of their ear, and try and get in there. And then on the national level, there actually is a Pennsylvania representative, Cartwright, I think Matt Cartwright, that's his first name, I believe, who represents Northeastern PA, and he has a law, or what he would like to become a law, called Cleaner, C-L-E-A-N-E-R, and he's brought this up over the years, and that the Cleaner's focus, its aim, is to actually end this exemption. So there is, and I know some groups, I know NRDC, and actually many other groups, there's a list of 100, I believe, environmental groups that have been behind Cartwright on this cleaner bill. And this would, the aim is to do just this, to end the exemption. So there is, there's another ear you could shout in. And I would just say, any ear you've got, any opening, any door that's an inch open, just try and pry it so it's fully open, and then send in the armies.
Well, I'm very sorry to say we're at the end of our time. We haven't made it through half of the questions that were posed. I think that speaks to the deep level of interest and concern about this issue. Justin, I feel like we are really indebted to you, not solely for the presentation tonight, which I really appreciate, but for the work that you have done in bringing this really vital issue to the light of day, and revealing these scary truths that it's now going to be incumbent on all of us on the phone and our friends and allies to deal with. I will say that PSR looks forward, Justin, to finding more ways to work with you and bring your findings, as you're saying, to more ears to shout in. And I hope that our listeners will want to be a part of that effort too. Stay tuned to the PSR website, psr.org, and in the coming weeks and months we'll have more information. Thank you everybody for being with us on this presentation. We had a really good turnout, and I know a lot of you who've stuck with us through to the end. It's time to wrap up, so thank you all very much, and good night.
Thank you. And I would say, if folks are still there, please feel free to email me with any questions that weren't asked. I will absolutely love to respond and follow up with anyone. Yeah, thank you.
You know, may I tell you what? I'll PSR will send them to you, and we'll be happy to post your responses on our website.
Perfect. Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.